Hello everyone. If you are new to my channel, then consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do it, thanks. By the way, I also have a Luffy fan fiction channel. If you are interested, the link is in the description. Devils, Angels, Dragons, and Naruto? By MothBallz. Having fulfilled his role as the child of prophecy and bringing true peace to the elemental nations, Naruto leaves in search of a new adventure. What am I? Nothing but a wandering sage. Harem. Godlike Naruto. I don't own anything, adios.
Rias happily greeted a grinning Naruto by hugging him around his neck and kissing his cheek, Naruto wrapping his arm around her waist in return. That was really impressive, Naruto-senpai. But why didn't you bring out your blade? Kiba questioned. From their many spars, the blonde knight knew that Naruto was a master swordsman of the highest caliber and could have made a show of it as well. Well, my sword was actually the one my mother originally wielded, named Benikachu, Crimson Whirlpool. I don't like using it unless I feel someone has my respect or hatred, and Riser had neither, Naruto explained. What about senjutsu? Kaneko asked from her spot on Naruto's back. Many would have asked how she had gotten there without anybody seeing her do so, but everybody had decided to leave the subject alone after they had asked said Neko show about it. She had simply given them a deadpan stare before resuming her eating of her cake. Though maybe her not answering had to do with the person who asked being Issei. She held a general dislike of Issei and anything associated with him. Naruto shrugged, didn't need it. Era. Any chance you can teach me how to use those chains of yours, Uzumaki-kun? Akeno asked with a wink. She had seen them before, of course, back in the church incident, but had been too preoccupied with other things to pay much attention to them. Being able to fully observe them now though had piqued the interest of her sadist side. Naruto knew the reason why she was asking and only nervously chuckled, hee. Sorry Akeno-chan, but they're kind of a family-exclusive technique. Akeno only fake pouted in response. Ah, what a shame. I could have used them for some activities ufu. The shy Dampier Liza walked up to Naruto and lowered her head to hide her blushing face. Go. Good job, Naruto-san. Naruto smiled and put his hand on her shoulder. Hey, none of that. Call me Naruto-kun or Naruto-sensei, okay? The girl lifted her head and demurely smiled back, hi. Before anything else could be said, both of Ria's parents, Riser's parents, and the four Satans walked up to the group. With a grim face, Lord Phoenix walked up to Naruto and extended a hand. On behalf of the Phoenix clan, I extend my congratulations to you. We also acknowledge that our contract with the Gremory family is now null and void. Naruto shook the offered hand and took notice of both his saddened face as well as the somewhat puffy eyes of his wife. He may not know their exact feelings, but he could see that it had been difficult for them to watch their youngest son get beaten in such a manner and then permanently lose a limb. Knowing that, Naruto spoke up before the two could fully leave. It's not gone forever. This caught the attention of everyone, and the Phoenix matriarch turned hopeful eyes to Naruto. When I first started working on creating the technique, it was too unstable and actually badly damaged my own arm in addition to the target in the process of using it, because I had to use it at point-blank range. Normally that would have meant that I would have no use over my arm as my nerves and cells were all but torn to shreds when I first used it. However, as you can see, I still have full use of said limb. But you destroyed his entire arm. There's nothing there. You're right. However, my arm was healed through my own healing factor, which pales in comparison to the one I have now, or your family's. What I'm trying to say is that if he focuses enough energy into that arm and makes his healing factor work over time, eventually his arm will start to grow back and those phoenix tears of yours will only speed up the process. Looks of realization dawned on everyone's faces as Naruto talked, a look of hope shining in the Phoenix matriarch's eyes. While she knew her son had been a less than admirable person, that didn't change the fact that he was her son. Both she and her husband had half expected the redhead in front of them to gloat about his victory over the Phoenix clan's famed healing factor, but instead here he was helping them. Thank you, Mr. Uzumaki, the newly smiling mother said, with tears brimming her eyes. Naruto just rubbed the back of his head and smiled. Don't worry about it. After all, I am responsible for him losing it in the first place. It's the least I could do. All the onlookers smiled in appreciation at what Naruto had done. Instead of gloating about his victory or being cold to the parents of his opponent, he had instead extended a hand of friendship and took it upon himself to help the man he had just wounded. Looks like you chose quite the man, Rias. Powerful, kind, and honorable. I wonder if he would mind. And now grinning Sazex thought as he glanced between the laughing teen who was now technically his brother-in-law and the ever-stoic figure of his queen. He then sweat dropped as the unsuspecting teen was victim to the hyperactive devil known as Seraphal. It seemed she had gained a fascination for the sage and his various powers. Seeing that he was a kind-hearted individual was all the convincing the Leviathan needed to introduce herself. The bead of sweat grew larger as he saw that his sister's rook, Kaneko, was heatedly glaring at the Satan from her position on the back of the blue-eyed teen. Yeah, he probably won't mind having another, and Grafia does deserve to have some happiness, and with her doting over him she'll stop nagging me. It's a flawless plan. Many began to wonder if Searsex had truly lost it when he began to cackle, seemingly at random, like a mad scientist who had just finished telling everyone about his master plan to take over the world or some other inane nonsense. Luckily, before the powerful Satan could embarrass himself further, Grafia came to his rescue by pulling harshly on his ear till it comically stretched. Ow. That hurts, Grafia. That is not behavior appropriate for the current Lucifer to be displaying in public. Later that night, a very tired Naruto walked out of the shower using a fluffy towel to dry off his rather long locks. Once upon a time his hair had been short and spiky and had refused to obey the laws of gravity. Now with it being so long, it was too heavy and thick to stick up, so it fell in rough waves that were a mixture of his mother's smooth tresses and his father's own spiky hair. He had debated on getting it cut many a time due to how troublesome it was to dry and fight with, but many women in his life had asked, demanded, that he let it grow out. As Naruto pondered over thoughts of his hair, he failed to notice the person standing at the foot of his bed, though that may also have been due to how her rigid stance allowed her to be passed off as a statue in the dimly lit room. Thus, when Naruto did finally take notice of the figure, he let out a manly grunt of surprise. Okay, so it wasn't really a grunt, or manly. Alright, he yelled like your girlfriend did when she saw a spider in the shower and began demanding you to kill it. Grafia, being Grafia, was nonplussed by the action, and merely waited for Naruto to get his heart rate back under control. Noticing that Naruto was no longer on the verge of having a heart attack at the age of 17, the extra devil spoke up. I apologize for intruding on you like this, Naruto-sama. Said teen raised an eyebrow at the added suffix, what's with the sama crap? As you are now engaged to Rias-sama and I am the maid of the Gremory house, it is only fitting that I address you as such. Naruto sighed as he pinched the bridge of his nose. He was by no means new to people calling him Naruto-sama, Uzumaki-sama, or some other equally stuffy title. In fact, he had been almost universally hounded by it after the Fourth Shinobi War, since he had played a rather large role in their eventual victory over the megalomaniac Tobi, Obito. Hell, there had even been some rather fanatical people who had gone as far as to set up a whole religion around him. He had tried, and unfortunately failed, to put a stop to that. However, he thought that he had escaped that whole octful titles when he had left his dimension all those months ago. I have a feeling that no matter what I do or say, you are going to keep referring to me with that title, huh? Naruto asked, already knowing the answer. Correct, was Grafia's curt reply. Naruto sighed again, before he just waved his hand in a motion for the maid-themed devil to continue. I came here to thank you for doing what you did for Rias-sama. I've known her since she was a child and have grown attached to her and wish nothing but her happiness. However, I knew I had no place to argue against the contract that would eventually ruin that. Not only do you make Rias happy, you are also powerful enough to keep her safe from harm and have given her one of her deepest desires. You have done what I nor her brother or parents could. For that I thank you. What Grafia did next made Naruto highly uncomfortable. She got on her hands and knees and prostrated herself at his feet. Naruto, being who he was, did not like that at all, and so leaned down and grabbed the Lucifuge by her arms and gently pulled her to her feet and looked into her questioning eyes. None of that. I did what I did not for the glory it would bring, but because Rias-chan asked me to, and that's it, so I don't need you bowing to me like that now or ever, alright? Grafia was internally surprised to hear the amount of conviction that was in Naruto's voice. It showed her that he really was telling the truth. To think that he fought a random stranger, someone who he had little knowledge about, and willingly put himself in a position where he would be scrutinized, looked at more closely, all because Rias had simply asked him to. It spoke volumes about the type of person Naruto was, and now Grafia was beginning to see why those whom Naruto called his precious people cherished their bond with the Uzumaki. Why they knew that no matter what he would always try his hardest to make sure they were happy and safe. This was also why Naruto had so many fangirls and why so many women had come to ask him to marry them. Grafia recomposed herself after being caught a little off guard by Naruto's strength of will when the two heard the door open and Rias walked in. What had Naruto heavily blushing and almost drooling was what she walked in wearing. The Gremory heiress wore a very see-through black lace teddy that hung off of her bountiful curves and left her smooth alabaster skin to almost glow in the dim light of the room. Underneath the skimpy item that only went as far as mid-thigh, she wore an equally lacy black bra and panty set that covered up her more private bits. The color of the ensemble contrasted nicely with her flawless skin and vibrant red tresses that fell in shiny waves past her shoulders. Had Naruto not had his legendary strength of will, he probably would have jumped the devil right then and there and consummated their newly official nuptials. While the sage may have seen plenty of naked women in his life, Jiraiya made sure of that, and done his fair share of the vertical tango with plenty of beautiful women. Rias was something else. While kunoichi were naturally more fit and curvaceous due to their training and everyday lifestyle, there was something to be said about the beauty of a pure-blood devil. Kami-sama, help me. Grafia, what are you doing in here? Rias asked, unaware of the effect she was having on her fiancé. Grafia bowed and spoke, "I apologize, mistress, but I was merely making sure that Master Naruto was comfortable and taken care of. I'll be taking my leave now." With one last bow to both, the silver-haired maid did as she said and left the two alone. Doing so allowed Rias to turn her attention to the man who had saved her from an unwanted marriage contract, by putting her into another one. Now that she thought about it, that was a little odd how that worked out. Nonetheless, she was happy with the turnout. True, she was still under contract to marry someone, but that someone was an honorable, kind, smart, and powerful being. The fact that Naruto was by no means unattractive was a great bonus. That in mind, Rias took this chance to really look at Naruto. Sure, she had slept with him before, but she hadn't really had the chance to look him over, as he was usually always asleep and covered by thin sheets or wearing a shirt. Here he was now though, freshly out of the shower and shirtless, and boy did she like what she saw. Naruto was by no means buff, nor was he thin and wiry. Instead, he had a chiseled body made of compacted muscles that betrayed the amount of strength she knew those muscles were capable of beneath his tanned skin. Rias knew that Naruto was a borderline training nut and was continuously pushing his body past its limits, and did it show. There was not an ounce of fat to be found on his body. However, she found her eyes drawn to the few scars that dotted his body here and there. The two that stood out the most were the fist-shaped one near his heart and the large circle that outlined his lower abdomen. She of course knew where both of them came from, having asked him about them a few days after seeing them. Even still, she was always somewhat mesmerized with the wounds. It was a testament to how powerful his regeneration was and how powerful the techniques were to still leave a scar despite said healing ability. She sauntered up to her fiancé and began to gently trace her fingers across the grooves and contours of the scarred flesh. Rias calmly said, "You're a crazy moron, you know that?" Naruto only laughed at that. "That seems to be how everyone I know feels about me, but I wasn't called Konoha's most surprising ninja for nothing, ya know." Honestly, that was the one title Naruto was proud of. Sure, it was cool to be likened to the father of ninjutsu, but doing so also likened Naruto to a godlike figure, something Naruto wasn't exactly comfortable with. Sure, he knew he was strong, but as strong as the man who was said to fight the thing responsible for the birth of life in their world and win. Yeah, he wasn't that strong. The real reason he liked the other title so much though was that it was his and his alone. There was no second most surprising nin, there was just him. He was and will always be Konoha's most surprising shinobi. It also helped that it was Kakashi who had originally given him the moniker back when he was just some snot-nosed arrogant brat that was out to prove himself. Naruto wrapped his arms around Ria's smaller frame and plopped himself down on the edge of his bed, situating the Gremory heiress on his lap. The two just sat there, Rias with her head leaned on his shoulder and arms wrapped around his neck, while Naruto wrapped his arms around her waist and let his face lay in the crimson tresses he so adored. He quietly chuckled a little as a thought entered his mind. Without even opening her eyes, Rias asked, "What's so funny, Naruto-kun?" Naruto just smiled and said, "It's funny cuz I just thought about how like my father I am and how my mom would feel about you." "Oh, what do you mean? Remember how I told you that my dad originally fell in love with my mom because he thought that her hair was beautiful? Well, I guess I inherited that love of red hair as well." The two chuckled at that. "And what about your mom?" "She'd love you. The fact that you and her share a lot of the same qualities would only make her happier." Minutes later found the two covered by a thin sheet and wrapped in the arms of the other. Naruto had laughed when a frustrated Rias finally got fed up and tossed off her clothes before resuming her position in her future husband's arms. Elsewhere, a certain Biju was nervously biting her lips as she raced back towards the Gremory house, her flaming hair fluttering in the wind as she ran at speeds that would make even a cheetah green with envy. "Naruto-kun is not gonna like this one bit." "Naruto, ni wake up," came the bubbly voice of the ex-nun Asia as she knocked on his temporary, maybe permanent with him being engaged to Rias now, bedroom's door. While many devils would have looked at the young girl in disdain, human but a former member of the church, the Gremory were not like most families. In fact, Searsex and even Grafia had taken a shine to the cheerful blonde. Her naturally bubbly personality coupled with her cuteness made it very hard for anyone, even thousands of years old devils, to not like Asia. It also helped that her pseudo-brother was a sage capable of atomizing any of those who got on his bad side, and from what they had seen from his match with Riser, even talking bad about one of his precious people was reason enough to mutilate someone. Needless to say, Asia had been welcomed with open arms into the Gremory family. "Naruto-sensei still isn't up?" came the monotone voice of the equally adorable Rook, Kaneko. Already used to the Neko show randomly popping up unannounced, something she probably picked up from Naruto, who had a habit of doing the same thing and scaring the crap out of people. Asia just pouted before nodding her head. "Odd," was the curt reply. In all honesty, it really was odd for Naruto. Everyone knew that due to his former profession he was always up before the sun either to train or meditate. Considering that it was almost time for breakfast and he still hadn't rolled out of bed, it was a little worrying. Both took notice of the shuffling form of the still sleepy Issei walking past them, no doubt to grab some of the breakfast that Grafia and the other servants had prepared. Upon seeing him, Kaneko saw the perfect chance to not only mess with the pervert of a pawn, but also to find out why her sensei was still deep asleep. Without even turning to look, Kaneko grabbed the hem of Issei's shirt to grab his attention. Pervert. Issei began to cry at the disrespect. Not at all bothered by the blubbering form of the sacred gear holder, Kaneko continued. Bucko wanted us to tell you that she requested that you wake her up around this time so she doesn't miss breakfast. Asia saw what Kaneko was trying to do and could only sigh. It seemed her Ni-chan had rubbed off on the young Neko in more ways than one. She would have tried to stop the silver-haired devil if she didn't know that any of her protests would go unheard. Nonetheless, she said a quick prayer, hoping Issei wouldn't be hurt too badly. The once blubbering Issei did a total 180 and was now happily marching towards the bedroom door, none the wiser to what was about to happen to him. The teen swung the door open and in a boisterous voice called out, "Time for breakfast, Ria-senpai." The rest of the Gremory home were either awoken, from sleep or a half-asleep state, or startled by the girlish scream of fear that rang through the large structure. Of course, with the amount of fear the scream had been seeped in, everyone hurriedly made their way to the source only to find an odd sight. Before them was a bleary-eyed and shirtless Naruto, a very much naked and irritated Rias, a slightly smirking Kaneko, and Asia doting over a balled-up mass of flesh and tears otherwise known as Issei. On the wall above said quivering pawn were several kunai as well as a rather sizable hole in the wall only inches away. Seeing the equally aggravated looks Rias and Naruto had on their faces, no one dared to question what happened or interrupt the two when they slammed the door to presumably return to the land of sleep, though it was not at all hard for them to take an educated guess on what had transpired. Everyone was surprised when Office, in a very risque nightgown, grumbled, "Too early in the morning for this shit," and waltzed away. They weren't so surprised she had cussed, but were more shocked that she was even there in the first place, the Gremory family wondering who she was and how she had come into their home. Searsex was the first to recover and ask, "Who?" Akeno, who had grown used to the loli's coming and goings, was the one to answer. That would have been Ophis, the infinite dragon god. If the Gremory family members hadn't been awake before, they sure were now. A wide-eyed Lord Gremory managed to stutter out, "How, what, why?" As one Akeno, Kiba, and Kaneko simply pointed to the room occupied by a certain pair of redheads. As everyone was finally seated at the table and happily filling their stomachs with the food that Grafia and the other servants had prepared for breakfast, Searsex decided to bring up the subject of Ophis' current presence in his family's home. Naruto, why is Ophis eating breakfast with us?" Deciding to be a bit of a smartass, Naruto calmly replied, "I assume it's because she's hungry." Issei nearly choked on his mouthful of pancakes as Asia worriedly patted the teen's back to help. Akeno had to hold in a chuckle. Kiba coughed in an attempt to cover up his own laughter. Rias covered her mouth to hide her smile. Liza tried to hide her laugh by looking down and sinking further into her seat, while Ophis and Kaneko continued to eat calmly like nothing had happened. Searsex's eyebrow twitched in annoyance and being so nonchalantly dismissed. Nonetheless, he continued, "Let me rephrase that. Why is one of the strongest beings in existence eating at our table like it's the most normal thing in the world?" Naruto had to hold in a grin. "Well, that depends. I assume you're doing it because this is your family's home and I'm doing it because I was invited to." Rias could only shake her head at her fiancé's antics. Only Naruto would think it was funny to antagonize her brother, the strongest of the Satans and one of the few super devils to exist. On the other hand, she knew that despite all of that, her brother was a major goofball not unlike Naruto himself. Searsex's face palmed before asking in a strained voice, "Why is Ophis the Ouroboros dragon in my family's home and why are you two so chummy?" Ophis finally chose to speak up at that moment. "He interests me. Also, he can help me with my goal." Hearing that jarred Searsex and the others. Everyone knew that Ophis had taken some kind of interest in the resident sage, possibly due to his strange powers, but to hear that she planned on having Naruto help her with her goal, whatever that was not something they had expected. Searsex was one of the most unsettled by this simple proclamation for several reasons. One did not simply catch the attention of one of the strongest and oldest beings to exist. However, he knew the answer to that. Simply put, Naruto was interesting. From his personality to the powers and techniques he had in his arsenal, the kid was very interesting. Hell, he and Ajuka had spent quite a few hours discussing just how Naruto was capable of things he had done. However, he also knew that Ophis would very rarely venture outside of the dimensional gap without some reason. In the past, it was usually to satiate some curiosity of hers or some other mundane task. However, to hear that this time she had a goal and intended to enlist Naruto's help for it was unsettling. Who's to say Ophis didn't play on destroying hundreds, possibly millions of lives just to get that peace and quiet that she so fervently sought out? As it was, there was no being outside of Great Red who could combat the Ouroboros dragon, but having Naruto on her side, if killing really was on her mind, then there would an almost mass extinction with Naruto on her side, when even he and the other Satans would be hard-pressed to stop. So it was with a steely voice Searsex asked, "And what exactly is your goal?" Ophis looked up and stared unblinkingly into Searsex's turquoise eyes and said, "Peace and quiet." At hearing those words, part of Searsex was ready to try his damnedest to stop Office, and by extension Naruto, from pursuing said goal, but he had not been made leader of the 4 great Satans by acting on such rash decisions. Despite the seemingly calm manner in which they were talking, everyone could feel the tension begin to thicken, setting everyone on edge. "And how do you plan to accomplish that exactly?" Searsex asked, muscles twitching in preparation. Without even blinking, Office spoke, "By having Naruto remove Great Red from the dimensional gap." The sound against wood or plates echoed throughout the kitchen as most of the people at the table dropped their silverware in shock. While Searsex was very much so relieved that he had been wrong about what Office's goal was, he was still unsettled by the idea that she would so easily believe that Naruto, a young teen, would be capable of fighting a god-like being such as Great Red. Sure, he was strong. Searsex and Ijuka had even speculated he may even be on the level they were on, a super devil, despite his humanity, but on the level of a dragon god? The gap between even the power of the 4 Satans combined and Great Red and Office was massive. To Red and Office, he and the other Satans would be nothing but mere annoyances should they try and fight them. There was just no logical way that Naruto, a human several thousands of years younger than he and millennia younger than Red, could even scratch Red. No offense to you, Naruto, but I highly doubt that he could help you with such a goal, Office. Again in that same monotone voice Office spoke, "He's already beaten Red once before." What? Came several shouts that shook the house. Even Grafia, who had been carrying in a tray of food, had stopped dead in her walk and dropped said tray in shock. Yet still Naruto and Office continued to eat like nothing had happened. While most would agree that Naruto defeating Great Red in combat would indeed answer the question as to why Office was so interested in the sage, it raised even more questions. How strong was Naruto really? What else was Naruto hiding? How long had he been in this world? And then there was the question nobody had bothered to ask: why was he here in the first place? "So now you're the official fiancé to a red-haired beauty from a prestigious clan? Ha ha ha, Gaki, you can never do anything half-assed, can you?" came the booming voice of a massive toad wearing a Yakuza jacket with a massive scar across one of its eyes. This was Gamabunta, former boss of the Toad subcontract, but he had since passed that title onto his son Gamakichi and taken to enjoying the relaxation that came with being a retired summon boss. He and his clan's summoner, Naruto, were currently relaxing atop a mountain as they gazed out at the scenery below whilst enjoying some of the Toad clan's famous Mount Myobokusake. Naruto chuckled as well. "Yay, ain't that the truth? Guess the apple really doesn't fall from the tree, nay? It certainly doesn't. Let's not forget that you still have that vixen after you and now a little Neko girl as well. Jiraiya would be proud," laughed the massive toad. After the fiasco in the underworld and the ensuing drama that came with mortally wounding a supposedly immortal devil and then being engaged to one of the heirs of the most prominent clans in Devil Society, Naruto needed some much-deserved R&R. It didn't help that Rias had become even more fervent in her quest to get some sexual rise out of him while trying to find out what made him tick. He wasn't really bothered by either of those, he was engaged to her after all, but he still wasn't exactly to spill his whole life story to her just yet. Sure, he had let slip a few details: his former jinchuriki status, his parents, his profession, and his role in the 4th Shinobi War, but there was still so much he hadn't told her about. He was hesitant to tell her the amount of shit he had to put up with growing up an orphan and being the village's scapegoat. Then there were the things he had done and seen during the war that had left him a changed man. Then there were the people that had slowly become a part of his pseudo-family, dead or alive, like Tsunade, Haku, Kakashi, Gaara, and so many more. He was sure that she had some inkling as to the things that he was hiding from her. She was a smart young woman after all, and growing up as the little sister to one of the Mao, who were essentially war heroes themselves. He was sure she wasn't at all naive to the atrocities and horrors of war. Still, he wasn't that comfortable just spilling his guts to someone he had only known for almost 3 months, regardless of them being engaged. However, Rias was far from his only worry. Akemi was still hounding him to become her mate, which was becoming harder and harder to say no to. Kaneko had become even more clingy and had even started to make suggestive moves on him, which, due to how old she looked, unnerved him greatly. And then Searsex had to go and open his big fat mouth and mention that as the last member of 2 powerful clans and as the soon-to-be technical head of the Gremory house alongside Rias, he could by all means start his own harem. The cheeky bastard had then attempted to not so subtly suggest that Naruto include both Grafia and Serafal in his harem of awesomeness. Grafia had of course beaten the Lucifer silly for even suggesting that, but she had then confronted Naruto later that night and told him that as the maid of the Gremory home she would fulfill any of his needs. Serafal had only shrugged at the suggestion, then winked at him. It still baffled Naruto to this day that those 2 powerful, beautiful, intelligent, and respectable women would somehow have no issue with being in a harem. He was sure that they would object in all manners, but nope. Naruto had been even more sure that Rias would have spoken up about him starting his own harem of women, but instead she had merely shrugged and said, "Though it's somewhat rare these days, it is still a pretty normal thing." After all, Riser's peerage were all women that I'm sure he had sex with, and he would be far from the first to do so. How Naruto found himself in these situations was beyond him. Then there was the news that Akemi had relayed to him on what she had found out about the thing that resided in some sealed dimension. A being so powerful and dark that it had taken every ounce of the biblical god's power to just seal away. Yeah, that wasn't exactly something he wanted to tangle with without a lot of preparation. Of course, that wasn't the end of that though. On top of all that, there just had to be some group of powerful and evil villains that wanted to free said entity so that they could harness its power. Bunta, did you ever feel like Kami is just toying with you for his or her own amusement? Naruto asked aloud. Gaki, I'd be lying if I didn't say that didn't sound like your whole life in a nutshell, Gamabuto replied. Thought so, Naruto sighed comically. But he look on the bright side, you get a harem full of gorgeous and powerful women to make up for it, though if you piss any of them off. Well, it was nice knowing ya, Naruto, Gamabunta guffawed. Thanks, Bunta. Y'all really know how to cheer a guy up. Bah, just forget about all that right now and let's enjoy the rest of this sake before I have to go back home and deal with the missus. Kanpei, they cheered. Wait, so you've known about this Naruto-kun? Rias asked her Finis. Currently both her and her peerage were cleaning up the Kuo Academy student council room, as it would soon be the site of one of the most high-profile gatherings in the world. Naruto was of course helping out with the use of his ever-useful group of Kage Bunchins. Today was to be a momentous day, as the leaders of the three factions would be gathering to discuss the possibility of not only making another treaty but possibly putting an end to hundreds of years of animosity altogether. In attendance would be both Michael and Gabriel, Sirzex and the other Mao, and Azazel with 3 fallen escorts. Yeah, remember I bumped into Michael and Gabriel a few weeks ago? Well, when I was talking to them they mentioned that they would like me to act as a sort of neutral party to the debates. Azazel agreed with that, and so have your brother and the other Mao, Naruto nonchalantly replied. I guess that makes sense with you being on friendly terms with each of the factions, though wouldn't our engagement kind of throw that off balance? Rias questioned. Normally yeah, but since I've done plenty of high-class jobs for the other 2 factions I'm on good terms with devils as well. At least that's what your brother says, Naruto chuckled. And what's that supposed to mean him? Naruto just turned to look at the floor as bright red seal bearing the crest of Lucifer appeared, soon after revealing the forms of not only Sirzex Lucifer, but Seraphal, Ajuka, and Falbium. That you're a goofball, Naruto grinned. Like you're one to talk, Sirzex called back. Before Naruto could rebuttal, Seraphal launched herself at Naruto like a homing missile and called out, Narutan. At the same time, a golden glow from the other side of the now somewhat cramped room announced the arrival of not only Michael but Gabriel, who had copied Seraphal and launched herself at the Uzumaki with a cry of, Naru-chan. Naruto was soon victim to not one flying tackle, but 2 flying tackles which ended in a human sandwich, Naruto being at the center of it. Of course, when both women soon realized that they weren't the only one hugging the life out of our lucky red-headed protagonist, sparks flew. Everyone there knew that Seraphal and Gabriel both had somewhat of a rivalry going. No one really knew where or why it had started, but all knew that they were forever trying to show up the other in one way or another. Naruto had heard some of the things they had done in pursuit of trying to prove who was the better of the 2, and he had been eerily reminded of a certain scarecrow sensei of his and said sensei's eternal rival. I swear it feels like I never left the elemental countries sometimes, Naruto thought to himself. Before an all-out war between the 2 could start, which may well have been possible from the glares they were sending the other, Azazel chose to intervene. As much as I enjoy seeing the kid in pain, you might want to let him go before he dies due to lack of oxygen, the Fallen chuckled. Both women looked down to see Naruto's face turning an odd shade of blue, as his face was currently trapped between their bosoms. While Gabriel was by no means as busty as Seraphal, she still had enough curves to initiate the deadly hug of beautiful death. Noticing that they were only seconds away from killing the object of their affections, both hurriedly let go, allowing the young Uzumaki to gasp and cough for some much-needed air. Everyone shared a good laugh at Naruto's misfortune. Fortune in the eyes of most, before the heads of each faction locked eyes and the air in the room grew noticeably more tense. While the 4 Satans had no reason to necessarily hate Michael or even Azazel, they knew that both angels had more than enough reason to be wary of them, mostly due to it being the machinations of their predecessors partially being the reason for the Great War in the first place. In a weird way, the wariness of both angels made the devils in the room even more wary. Luckily, before an awkward silence could settle in, Naruto clapped his hands and spoke out. Well, we might as well get this over with. Nay? I hate having to be a part of these boring meetings longer than I have to be after all. Everyone chuckled at Naruto's immaturity, while the faction leaders each shot Naruto a grateful look for breaking the ice, as it were. Clapping his hands on the floor of the room and pumping a small spark of his chakra into the seal there, Naruto unsealed a massive round mahogany table with matching chairs that had black leather backings to make them somewhat more comfortable. Nodding at each other, the respective groups took up spots in a way that formed a triangle. Rias and her peerage stepped back and stood near a wall so as not to interfere with the proceedings. Naruto himself merely crossed his arms and stood off to the side of the table where he would referee the debate, though he doubted he would need to do such a thing. Despite the tension in the room riding high, he knew that none of the people gathered here were hot heads or even disliked each other. Were they cautious of each other? Definitely, but being a shinobi, Naruto knew that caution was always a good thing to have, especially around potential allies. Azazel was the first to speak up surprisingly. I agree with the kid. I don't want to be here longer than I gotta be, so let's get straight to the point. Yeah? I think we can all agree that we wish to renew the current ceasefire while also instating a new treaty of sorts to put an end to the years of tension. Searsex calmly spoke. I am in full agreement with Azazel. Though the question remains, what kind of treaty will this be? A trade treaty like the ones humans have between allied countries? Michael spoke up next in his soft and melodious voice. That would seem to be the best route to go, though it must be said that attempting to do so would be difficult with things as they are now. Ajuka nodded his head. Yes, ideally we would love to just instate the treaty, but I think we all know that none of our manufacturers or farmers would be okay with trading with a race they've hated for several hundred years. On top of that, even if we did somehow manage to get trade between us all going, there would definitely be some dissent among our people that would lead to some seeking to put a stop to the trade for whatever reason. Falbium added his 2 cents in. The collective group of powerhouses nodded at that, each all aware of their respective races' less than pleasant feelings in regards to the other 2 races. Though angels were by nature as kind as possible, despite there being the possibility of giving into sin, but even they wouldn't be keen on trading with those they saw as lesser or evil. Xerxes and the other Satans though knew that the devils would be a little more outspoken about trading with angels, fallen or not, especially with the older devil families already feeling threatened by the growing number of reincarnated devils. Azazel knew there would be the same trouble on his own front, which was already in disarray due to the fact that the fallen didn't exactly have a place to call home. The devils had the underworld and even some human territories, and the angels had heaven. What did the fallen have? Nothing, having to resort to hiding in rundown or abandoned churches to keep out of the weather. With his people in such terrible condition, he knew that there would be revolt and outcries against a trade alliance with the races responsible for the poor state of the fallen race. If I may? Naruto asked. With everyone's eyes on him and a subtle nod from each, Naruto continued. I know that both the fallen and devils, especially the older families, won't react too kindly to the idea of trading with the enemy, and some may even try to put a stop to it through violence. Each of your situations also differ heavily, so you'll each need a somewhat unique approach. The angels are a bit of an easy task. I know that some of the other seraphim have gotten a bit bored with doing nothing, Uriel and Raphael mostly, so why not assign some of them to be kind of guards of the trading? Have them gather up their own little task force and give them the authority to handle any problems that may occur on your guys' side. Michael and Gabriel gave the team shinobi a smile of thanks as they realized that by following his suggestion they would take care of several problems all at once. Michael was especially grateful as Raphael had been bugging the Archangel for missions or something to do almost every day, and this would be the perfect opportunity to get the younger seraphim off his back. As for the devils, well, you guys can pretty much do the same thing. I'm sure you can even pass off the lower duties as requests for newly reincarnated devils. Then possibly get some of the 72 pillar families to elect one of their own to serve on the trading task force, I guess you could call it. Ajuka, who was deeply surprised at the amount of intelligence and wisdom the teen had, chose to rebuttal. That still doesn't fully take care of older families who will feel inclined to take action. Naruto chuckled and rubbed the back of his head. Honestly, I've never liked the whole Stephanus, and most of them are only strong politically. And even then those ties really couldn't damage any of you reputation-wise, so I say let them whine about it. Everyone had a good laugh at that. No matter what, Naruto would always be Naruto, even in moments like this. While that's all and good, I'm sure you know that the fallen are in less than great condition, and if this goes through, even with me backing it, it could come to there being a civil war, Azazel said in an uncharacteristically grim voice. Both Gabriel and Michael flinched at their brother's words. Despite the fallen having, well, fallen from grace, it didn't change the fact that at some point they had all been fellow angels, brothers in arms. Despite whatever sin they had given into, the fallen were still technically family, and both Gabriel and Michael knew that they had somewhat of a hand in the current situation their darker counterparts found themselves in. Naruto sighed at that as well. That's a bit harder. Honestly, I'm afraid that a civil war may be the only possible way to solve your issue and start over again. If it did come down to that, it may even help the treaty out by having both the devils and angels help your side in some way, weaponry or even manpower. Nobody was happy to hear that. There was a reason Azazel had backed out of the Great War so early, and after all, despite everything, he had once been an angel, a seraphim at that, and that would always be a part of his nature. At heart, the former leader of the Grigori was a pacifist. Searsex and the others could sympathize with Azazel. After all, it had been thanks to a civil war in the underworld that they had risen to their current status of power and prestige. Nonetheless, a war, especially one where you fought against those of your own kin, was far from pleasant business. In spite of it being against his nature, Azazel knew that as possibly the only figurehead and leader the fallen had, it was up to him to make the harder decisions, whether he liked it or not. So it was with a heavy heart Azazel nodded his head, a grim looking adorning his rough face. Then if it does come to that, can I count on help from you all? Michael stood from his seat and crossed his arm across his chest. Azazel, despite our differences, you will always be my little brother. In that same breath, the other fallen are also my family. You have the support of the angels in heaven, whatever you need that to be. Sirzek stood to his feet and nodded his head at the older man. We may have had some bad blood between our people, but I want that to end. If you or any of the fallen on your side need any help, you need only come and ask, and I and the others will do what we can. Before anything else could be said, a yell echoed from outside the walls. Not if we have anything to say about that. Within moments, the whole wall to the side of the meeting table was ripped from its foundations, revealing not just the sky but the legion of various fallen, yokai, magicians, and other assorted beings armed and ready. At the head of the small army were three notable figures: Kateria Leviathan, Valley Lucifer, and Kokebeel. Naruto decided to stop the impending evil guy monologue by grinning and crossing his arms. Well, about damn time you guys got here. Kateria narrowed her eyes, recognizing the redhead from his fight with Riser Phoenix. You can't have possibly known that we were coming, you cur. All she received as an answer was a well-tanned fist to the face that sent her careening down to the hard concrete below. The person responsible leapt backwards and put hands on her shapely hips. Sorry about that, but your face was beginning to bug me. Always were the impatient one, Akemi, Naruto said with the grin still firmly on his face. You're one to talk, Naru-kun, the vixen winked back. Naruto laughed before he cracked his knuckles. You guys ready? Rias appeared with the famed Baal powers of destruction lighting her hands aglow. Issei had his boosted gear at the ready, it already reaching his elbow. Kaneko was strapping on her gloves. Kiba held a sword in each hand. Akeno was all dressed in her Miko outfit. And Liza stood off to the side with Asia as support. Sirzek grinned as well and said aloud, "Give 'em hell, kids." Naruto nodded his head and created a Rasengan in each hand. By the way, Ophis and Mephisto send their regards. Naruto gave Issei a slight nod of his head, and that was all the brunette team needed before he was off in a blur. His devil wings unfurled and pushing him into the air. His fist covered in the crimson armor of boosted gear, the pawn slammed his appendage into the cheek of a shocked Valley Lucifer. Issei knew that normally he would be far too weak to fight on equal terms with the descendant of the original Lucifer, even with the intense training Naruto had put him and the others through, but right now they had the greatest advantage at their disposal: surprise. The Chaos Brigade had no clue that Naruto had been informed of their intentions by both Akemi and Ophis. Mephisto only helped solidify those claims, and so Naruto had seen fit to prepare everyone for the coming battle. Boost! Came the call of Diedrich. Bucko, promotion. Rook, Issei called out. Rias didn't even stop her own assault on the small army that surrounded her, merely calling out, "Granted." With a feeling of increased strength, Issei flew after his supposed rival, intent on using the Devil's Surprise to its fullest advantage. Rias herself was not at all idle, using a combination of the Baal clan's powers of destruction launched in large swaths to take out tens of enemies in a single swipe, along with her newly improved hand-to-hand combat to heavily damage those that got too close to her. While Naruto had given Issei some much-needed combat training, he had done something a little different with Rias and exposed to her the flaws of not only herself but of most devils that led their peerage. If the king doesn't move, then his subjects won't follow, were Naruto's exact words. Words she had taken to heart. After all, she may have been raised and taught to lead, but Naruto had actual battlefield experience, had seen bloodshed, and dirtied his own hands with it. He had led a massive army to fight against the machinations of a madman at the age of 16. A feat not many could claim, not even her brother. Not only had he helped her realize her faults as a leader, he had also helped her realize her faults as an individual combatant. While it was true the powers of destruction on their own were a destructive force, they were weak without a user who knew how to actually wield them. As much as she had patronized Issei for not being able to control boosted gear, she was no better, having minimal control over the Baal family's infamous powers. Naruto had thusly run her ragged, getting her to not only have better control over her family's powers but to also be able to call upon more of it without tiring. She was far and away from being anywhere near her brother's massive reserves and perfect control, but she was now able to actually fire off more than one shot of the power. With a fire in her eyes, Rias gathered a small amount of energy in her right fist before she launched the limb into the face of a magician who had been a little too brave. For his act of bravery, he earned a smoking hole in the place of where his face used to be. Using her wings, Rias was able to shield herself from an onslaught of fire magic. She then unfurled her wings and under the cover of the smoke launched her retaliation. A swath of crimson energy that exploded on contact with the one who had tried to roast her alive, taking not only that particular devil out, but a large number of those around him unfortunate enough to have been caught in the blast radius. Not too far away, the small frame of Kaneko was busy batting away enemies like they were naught but baseballs. Those that were hit by the young Neko found themselves either unconscious or in too much pain to get back up. While it was true Kaniko's strength was incredible before, being able to even dent steel, it was almost nothing compared to her new strength, something she had her senjutsu sensei to thank for. Naruto had seen and felt what the young reincarnated devil was capable of and was surprised, yes, but not shocked. His student's strength was impressive but paled in comparison to the strength of his teammate Sakura, and was a far cry from the might Tsunade wielded, even in her old age. With that in mind, Naruto began to teach his young student how his surrogate mother had been able to shatter bones with a flick of her finger. Sure, Kaniko wasn't at that level yet, and probably wouldn't be for several more years yet, but where her punches had once only left bruises, they now broke and shattered bone. A foolish devil thought that using magic on the young rook would be the end of the tiny powerhouse. He was however proven wrong when instead of being trapped in his vortex of wind she used it to slingshot herself to him, her outstretched fist punching straight through his ribcage. In a show of brutality, Kaniko ripped her bloodied arm out of the now long dead devil before she grabbed the corpse's ankle and used it like a bat, slamming the body into that of his comrade. With a punch she sent the two forms crashing into a large group. Before any of them could fully recover from the shock, Kaniko slammed her fist into the ground, causing large portions of concrete to rise. Grabbing a rather large chunk of the building material, Kaniko sent it hurtling at the still downed group of enemies, either crushing or heavily wounding those unlucky enough to be caught underneath the slab of rock. The rook narrowed her eyes as she felt someone's arms encircle her. The foolhardy devil, thinking that he was stronger than the smaller rook, was unprepared to feel his prey's elbow smash into his ribcage, cracking several ribs and sending blood and spittle from his gaping mouth. Using the arms around her as leverage, Kaniko picked up the larger devil and sent him into the ground, headfirst, where a resounding crack echoed. Still not done, Kaniko then kicked the body like a soccer ball, sending it careening into his shocked comrades. Speaking of shocking people, Akeno was living up to her title of Priestess of Thunder with the mass amounts of lightning magic she was using. Akeno had been one of the more unique members of Ria's peerage to train. Fundamentally speaking, the sadist was well versed in both her magic and even a few backup plans should that fail. However, Naruto soon discovered something Akeno kept buried deep. She had a burning hatred of fallen angels due to what she believed to be her father Barakiel's betrayal of her and her mother's love. Because of this hatred, Akeno shunned her fallen half, limiting herself to only the devil magic that she had been gifted with thanks to becoming Ria's queen. While it was true that she was still a very powerful devil, if Akeno let go of the hatred she held in her heart, Naruto knew that she would be a force to be reckoned with, being able to wield the power of light, something no devil could claim. Unfortunately, he didn't have the time to break down the barriers she had put like he had done with Kaniko. He had begun to, becoming even closer to the brunette, but he knew that he would need some catalyst to really break Akeno of her hatred. That in mind, he had decided to help Akeno become even more adept at controlling her lightning magic and increasing her reserves. He had even shown her some of the Raiden jutsu he knew and then helped her translate them into a technique she could use with magic. Naruto didn't know too many Raiden jutsu, nor was he as good at it as his pseudo-brother Sasuke, who was able to use the devastating Kirin, a jutsu that called down the very lightning and thunder of nature herself. But he still knew enough to give Akeno a somewhat larger arsenal than her usual method of going and zapping shit till it was nice and charred. Swirling her arms through the air and gathering the necessary magic for her next attack, Akeno had the lightning she had allowed to freely flow around her to surge in and join into one massive ball that crackled and sparked, the smell of ozone pervading the space around her. Reryuden, lightning dragon missile. From the ball of concentrated lightning came a rather large serpentine dragon whose body was made entirely out of lightning. Its eyes burn away the bidding of its master, it weaved itself through numerous enemies, shocking any of those close enough to it. Those who were unfortunate enough to actually be touched by the elemental dragon were left with the rancid smell of their very flesh being burned and roasted, while the rest of their bodies twitched and spasmed due to the various electrical shocks coursing through their nervous system. All the while Akeno herself was left in almost orgasmic bliss at seeing the amount of pain her victims were left in. She would have to find some way to thank Naruto for teaching her these magnificent attacks. Nearby, said red-headed Uzumaki had the urge to stay away from Akeno and to never be left alone with her for fear of her doing things to him that would make Anko grin in pride. The last battler of Ria's peerage, Kiba, was someone Naruto had the most fun training. While none of Ria's peerage lined up exactly with his style of battling, Kiba was the only one to come somewhat close, as the two both shared a love of and proficiency in sword combat that the others didn't. To top it off, Naruto was also the most familiar with the knight's speedy style of combat, as his rival teammate used almost the same exact style of fighting. However, while Sasuke had a huge arsenal of both Kaden and Raiden jutsu to bolster his style as well as the Sharingan to make his speed even more effective, Kiba relied solely on his speed and sword prowess. Even still, Naruto had no doubt that Sasuke would be able to utterly decimate Kiba in a straight battle. Kiba may be a more proficient swordsman, with Sasuke merely using his Tanto as a channel for his Chidori variants. But Sasuke was faster, physically stronger, more durable, and had a plethora of other jutsu and techniques to fall back on. As such, Naruto saw fit to help the handsome knight overcome one of the most glaring weaknesses of his position, durability. While Kiba was fast, he could not keep up that speed for long lengths of time, and with his stamina rather low, after a certain stretch of time the blonde Bishonen would become sloppy in his sword strikes and become more sluggish in his overall movements. With Kiba having almost zero defensive techniques to speak of, a good solid hit and he would be out of the fight quickly. That in mind, Naruto decided to help his fellow male by making sure that not only was he faster, but that he would be able to at least stand a few good hits while being able to sustain his swiftness for a little longer. Naruto was both the best and worst person for this. The red-haired sage was someone renowned throughout the elemental nations for his insane amount of stamina and durability, which coupled with his tenacity in a fight, had seen him winning against opponents many more years older than him on pure attrition. However, Naruto had never had to really train this, his insane amounts of stamina and healing coming from his uzumaki blood. Still, Naruto was able to help Kiba last longer in a battle the same way that he had learned to, fighting and training until he dropped and continuing when he got up. By the end of the training, Kiba had to question who was more of a sadist, Naruto or Akano. Nonetheless, the fruits of said training, torture, had bore some rather vibrant fruit, as the amount of bodies and limbs scattered around the night would attest to. A quick slash here and there, and in the blink of an eye 3 more magicians found themselves either lacking a limb or dead. Making use of his sacred gear, Sword Birth, Kiba summoned yet another demonic sword and grasping it in his left hand seemingly vanished. A few scant seconds later he appeared yards away, amidst frozen magicians, devils, and fallen. Said enemies soon exploded in a shower of gore and screams of pain. Looking around him, he noticed that his king and fellow peerage members were all doing well and had managed to clear out their fair share of enemies while only suffering from a few wounds, though nothing too fatal or debilitating. Combined, they had managed to cut the number of foot soldiers down by nearly half, an impressive feat for a group of young devils who had never seen pitched combat like this before. Kiba had to smile when he realized that they had also been receiving a little help from the other peerage that called Kuo home, the peerage of Sona Sitri. Said young devil had been fervent in her demands to help defend Kuo, citing that as the one tasked with its protection, it was only fitting that she and her peerage help in defending the school and surrounding town from harm. None could argue with the logic and so had consented to letting her help. Though individually her members weren't doing as much as Rias and her peerage were, combined they were more than making a dent in the enemy forces, attacking in sync with each other like a well-oiled machine. Sona herself was near Rias, starting a competition to see who could take out the most enemies. With as competitive as the two were, the body count around the two young heiresses was rising quickly. Of course, the higher-ups were not at all sitting by idly. While it wouldn't do for the leaders of any of the 3 factions to become involved in the fight, they had taken up the task of strengthening and maintaining the barrier around the school so that the surrounding town was safe from destruction. Both Naruto and Akemi were more than delighted by this, as this meant that they both could let loose some of their more destructive techniques without having to worry about endangering any of the nearby inhabitants. Sadly, though, Akemi wasn't able to unleash a Bijudama, as even the pooled strength of the leaders would be hard-pressed in containing such a massive and destructive force. While they would be able to pull it off, even by themselves, it would require more focus and energy to contain than anyone was willing to risk. Nonetheless, Akemi was greatly enjoying herself as she batted Kateria Leviathan around with her tails, making a show of how weak the Mao descendant was in comparison. Recovering from being sent into another building by one of Akemi's long fox tails, the devil angrily screamed in frustration. How is this possible? No mere Yukai should be able to hurt a devil like me so easily. Akemi haughtily grinned, sorry but I'm no Yukai. Suddenly an oppressive aura crashed down around Kateria and those close enough to Akemi, a vibrant cloak of crimson chakra igniting like flames around the 9 tails. A wave of her hand and an extended claw made of the corrosive chakra grabbed Kateria and brought her closer to Akemi, close enough for the former to be able to see the preternatural glow of the latter's eyes. A vicious grin stretched across the vixen's face as she spoke in an almost demonic growl, I'm a Biju. Kateria was sent hurtling through several of the school's buildings, impacting with such force that her body was only stopped after having been sent through a handful of buildings. The same grin on her face, Akemi stretched out one of her tails to grab a rather large spear of light before she tossed it back with equal force towards its owner, the fallen angel Kokebiel. A grinning Naruto appeared next to her, facing the opposite direction of his former tenant. How about we work together like old times, partner? 3 of Akemi's tails stretched and wrapped themselves around Naruto in a loving manner, gently caressing the sage while their master brought a finger to her lips, a thinking look on her face. Depends. What do I get out of it, partner? Akemi said with a saucy grin and flirtatious wink. Naruto blushed and nervously laughed as the Biju's tails continued to practically molest him on the spot. A frown marred the beautiful vixen's face as she used her hold on her former container to throw him into the air, allowing him to dodge out of the way of a large spear of light aimed to impale him. As the sage made his descent, he formed a Rasengan in hand and allowed gravity to pull him back down to the earth. Using the momentum of his fall, Naruto was able to slam the grinding ball of chakra directly into the back OED to take Akemi by surprise. Due to the force the tiny ball of chakra held, Kateria's speedy assault was halted immediately and she was harshly slammed into the ground with the blue chakra attack grinding into her back. Akemi was meanwhile busy using her tails to attack Konoha and defend herself from being impaled by one of his many light spears. Konoha himself looked to be ecstatic, an almost psychotic grin stretching across his face as he weaved in and out of Akemi's tail's attempts at either constricting him or piercing him. While his original plan had been a more underhanded way of restarting the war between the three biblical factions, he had to admit that this route was much more to his liking. He knew that the Maos would more than offer him and his forces a challenge, but with Valley the Hakuryuku as well as a large force of magicians backing them, not even the Mao would be able to stand against their combined power. It also helped that they had a rather powerful ace in the hole thanks to their former leader, Ophis. All in all, while it didn't directly afford the fallen angel the glee of kickstarting the massive war between three of the strongest preternatural factions and seeing the look on his former comrade and leader Azazel's face, the fact that he was now able to fight at near full capacity with such strong opponents was more than enough for him. "I never thought I'd fight such a young Kyuubi who was so powerful," Konoha shouted in barely restrained glee. Akemi only scoffed as she focused a little harder on actually hitting her opponent. While she had been informed that the fallen angel before her was untold centuries old and was at one point among the strongest of God's forces, she knew that he had no knowledge on her. In fact, only Naruto was privy to how old and powerful she truly was. She had sensed the presence of this world's 9 tails and admitted that they wielded power befitting the title of Kyuubi. However, this world's Kyuubi was a far cry from the power that she wielded. This world's Kyuubi was not but an impressively strong demon. She on the other hand was the strongest split part of a primordial god, given form and conscience by her father, a being who had transcended the shackles of his mortal frame to become so powerful as to be edging on the cusp of godhood himself. She had lived for countless centuries and watched as mortals grew to be able to wield the small fraction of power her father had seen fit to bestow upon them. That same power that allowed them to almost defy the laws of nature was not their own, however, it rightfully belonging to the Shinju of their world. As a part of such a being, the power the humans had come to call chakra thusly responded to her and her brothers and sisters as if they were its master, which was not too far from the truth. And here, alongside the man who had wormed his way into her heart, she would show these feeble beings why the humans of their world had feared her, why they saw her as a force of nature unto itself. With a grin stretching across her beautifully tanned face, Akemi wreathed herself in a flaming shroud of her chakra, her more animalistic features becoming even more pronounced. Her normally sharp canines grew in size, with her hair losing its normally smooth and silk-like texture in favor of a rougher and more fur-like appearance. Across the battlefield, many turned their eyes in awe at the oppressive weight that now made itself known to them. Even the impossibly strong faction leaders turned wide eyes upon the sight of Akemi lit ablaze by her powers made physical. For the first time in countless centuries, Azazel and Michael felt a level of power they had long forgotten, the power of a god. Naruto, who was only feet from her, could only grin and shake his head at the show of dominance his former tenant was putting on. Had he been anyone else, even a devil, he would have had to quickly distance himself from the corrosive nature of the pure unfiltered chakra the Biju was producing. However, having contained a portion of her might for all his life, the chakra did nothing to him. Instead of burning him, it gave off the warmth and feeling of a pet welcoming its master back home. As a teen, the chakra had once upon a time been as corrosive to his sanity and body as it was for any other creature who was not a Biju. However, with the blood of the sage running through his veins, his body grew accustomed to it. Mastering senjutsu and being exposed to that source of energy only cemented his immunity to the godlike energy. Now he could command his chakra, and even to a small extent the chakra of others, in a way only thought possible by the father of ninjutsu and the primordial god Jubi. He was possibly hundreds of years away from being as strong and as good at controlling it as Akemi was, especially now that she had merged her yin and yang halves to become whole again. When he still only contained her yang half, he had come close to being able to fight her on equal ground, though her massive kitsune form made that harder. Still, it was plausible, and he had come even closer to standing on equal ground with her after the whole Madara fiasco that left him with more chakra than some of the Biju. However, when she had been reunited with her yin half, she had regained all the sheer power that had given her the reputation of being a force of nature, a force that could fell mountains with a swish of her tails and cause the seas to churn with a mere splash. And now, after so long, Akemi could finally let loose some of the aggression she had pent up from decades of being imprisoned. Part of Naruto actually felt kind of sorry for Konoha. The fallen may have been a war-hardened veteran and one of the strongest angels outside of the Seraph, Azazel included, but Akemi stood above even the Seraph. While Naruto knew that he was just as strong, if not stronger, than Sirzax, who was lauded as the strongest devil outside of the original Lucifer, Akemi was easily on the same level of the various gods that inhabited this world. He dare say that she was close to being as strong as Great Red and Ophis, both of whom were said to be able to eradicate the world and still have enough power left over to do so several more times. If it came down to it, though, he knew that both the Ouroboros dragon and Apocalypse dragon would be able to defeat Akemi, his own victory over Great Red, thanks to the element of surprise, and that their fight was more of a brawl than an actual fight. The only being from their world who could stand on equal ground with the two dragon gods would be the Jubi, who even in a weakened state could very well destroy the nations with utter ease. Naruto was pulled from his thoughts as a fist to the face sent him barreling through several buildings only to have a blast of devil magic pin him to the ground and burn off parts of his skin. Sasuke and Tsunade would be so pissed if they knew I had just let this woman surprise me, Naruto thought with a frown, despite being nearly roasted alive by devil magic. Nonetheless, the onslaught of magic lifted and he rose to his feet, his uzumaki healing already kicking in to heal the burned areas of his skin and fix the dislocated jaw he had received from the punch, as well as the various other broken or damaged bones he had received from being thrown through several concrete buildings. Kateria's eyes opened wide as she watched from above as Naruto's burned skin was quickly replaced with freshly tanned skin, leaving only his torn clothing as the only sign that he had taken some damage. How? I thought the Phoenix were the only ones to hold such a healing factor, the Leviathan descendant screamed in anger. Naruto took note of her own disheveled appearance, both his own and Akemi's attacks on the female devil leaving her hair in a messy state, her already revealing clothing now revealing even more and her skin showing several bruises and cuts. Well, I guess you were wrong, huh? We Uzumaki are pretty resilient ourselves, Naruto laughed with a cocky grin. Kateria snarled at the comment, whatever. I'll just errata and leave only your ashes. Gathering an impressive amount of devil energy, Kateria sent the energy arcing towards Naruto's grinning form where it impacted, kicking up a cloud of dust and rubble. As the female devil was about to continue her assault, Naruto used the infamous Hireishin to flash in front of her, shocking the devil, and sent his leg careening into her abdomen. Powered by the chakra Naruto had funneled into the limb, Kateria was robbed of all her oxygen as she was harshly bent over Naruto's shin, almost making a perfect U. Naruto used his master over his futon affinity to keep himself suspended in the air for long enough to remove his left leg and use his right leg to send a bone-breaking heel drop to the still stunned devil's spine. Said devil was sent rocketing towards the harsh ground below once more as Naruto slowed his own descent with the help of chakra and his unnaturally high affinity to wind nature. The sage was not all surprised to see Kateria rise from the rubble her impact had created, a bloody face contorted into a snarl of pure hatred. Not wanting to allow his opponent any room to breathe, Naruto flashed through the necessary hand seals in only a blink of an eye and slammed his hands onto the ground, calling, Doden! Yomi Numa, Earth Release, Swamp of the Underworld. The ground around the two combatants was almost instantly turned into dark brown mud, covering a radius of several yards easily and trapping the Leviathan descendant in its thick and chakra-infused sludge. What is this filth? Kateria screamed as she struggled to wrench herself free of her muddy prison. Too late she noticed that the harder she struggled, the quicker she was being pulled down into the thick depths of the swamp. Naruto simply used a variation of the water walking exercise to stand just above the swamp created by his own hands. I wouldn't struggle too much, you're only speeding up the process. This jutsu is designed to trap you and eventually take you below where you will either be crushed by the weight of the mud or run out of air to breathe, Naruto explained calmly. Usually the jutsu was used to either slow down and trap large forces or even trap the massive bodies of summons. But the way he had used it not only spread out the swamp much wider but much deeper. Acting like quicksand, Kateria would eventually be pulled under and die of either asphyxiation or from the pressure exerted by the weight of the mud itself. He didn't very much like using this variant of the jutsu as it went against most of his principles and ended the fight in a manner that did not coincide with his own style. Nonetheless, he knew that this would guarantee that Kateria was trapped where she would either die or, if they finished this battle fast enough, be somewhere where they could easily come back for her if they needed any more information about the Chaos Brigade. Ophis had been helpful in alerting them to the group's members and some activities, but she had no idea what their true intentions were or how they planned to go about achieving those plans, as she was nothing more than a figurehead. Mephisto had known about them and been privy to a little more information than the emotionless lowly, but even his information could only do so much for them. If they could interrogate Kateria for more intel, said intel could only help them in the long run. Unfortunately, Naruto knew that if he had underpowered the jutsu, his prisoner would escape too easily, and he had as of yet to adjust his seals to working on devil energies, it being different from chakra. He had little doubt that any seals he would have tried to use on her would have only resulted in him being laughed at. With a sigh, Naruto turned and was about to flash to either help out Rias and her peerage or watch Akemi pummel Kokebyo. However, Kateria's malevolent laughter stopped him in his tracks. Turning, he raised an eyebrow as Kateria looked perfectly calm as she damn near leered at him. You are much stronger than I originally thought. Maybe when this is all over and we've defeated your worthless allies, I can keep you as my toy. It's been far too long since I felt the warmth of another body pressed up to me as we experienced the delicious sin of lust. Naruto narrowed his eyes as Kateria pulled out a vial that contained a writhing snake composed of an energy he was all too familiar with. With wide eyes he watched as she ingested the contents of the vial and was near thrown back by the explosion of power that followed. Damn it, Ophis. What the hell did you give these people? Akemi was enjoying herself as she played with her new toy. Firing off blasts of pure chakra and the occasional Kaiden jutsu was keeping Kokebile from getting anywhere close to her. Her 9 waving tails easily kept any of his thrown attacks from having any chance of reaching her and also helped in toying with the fallen angel. With as powerful and agile as the tails were, it was like Kokebile was fighting 10 different opponents, which was pushing him to perform aerial acrobatics, the whole affair looking like Akemi was using her tails like a puppet master with the strings of their puppet. Despite his valiant and impressive efforts, Kokebile was far from being unscathed. He had learned firsthand just how hot Akemi's fire attacks burned, some of his wings lacking feathers to prove it. The tails had also managed to score some hits on him as well, which had either fractured or broken some of his bones. His psychotic grin had been replaced with a grim frown, far too focused on avoiding death to be able to even entertain any other thoughts. A bored look eventually came to Akemi's face. With a sigh, she decided that she had gotten as much fun out of toying with the fallen angel as she could, and so decided that now was as good a time as any to end the battle, if it could be called that. With nary a thought, all 9 of her tails stretched and converged on Kokebile from all directions, leaving him with no way to escape from the furry appendage's grasp. 4 of the tails were used to keep each of the former angel's limbs from moving at all, while another 2 were used to keep Kokebile's many black wings bunched together, and the last 3 were aimed directly at a vital area, the tips sharpened through the use of chakra. If Kokebile so much as sneezed, he would be pierced by any number of the tails. Despite his situation, his face was not marked by fear but instead by a sneer of hate. TCH. To be caught and defeated by some yokai bitch, fucking disgusting. Akemi only grinned, like I told your comrade, I am no measly yokai. I am a biju, a tailed beast and the strongest of my brothers and sisters. Kokebile laughed derisively, comrade, that devil filth? She was just some bitch the boss had me working with along with that little shit valley. And who is your boss? We thought you wanted to start up the Great War again. I did and still do. Just cause I joined up with the Chaos Brigade doesn't mean I changed my mission of defeating that bastard Azazel. Lord knows that everyone in this damn group has their own agenda, Kokebile spat. Akemi only narrowed her eyes, then why attack the meeting? I highly doubt that you didn't already have another plan that could have just as easily done what you wanted it to. In response, the fallen smirked, I did. Was gonna be a great show and I would have left this whole town nothing but dust. Then the devils would retaliate and it would only be a short time before those prissy angels got involved. The war and bloodshed would have been glorious. Tired of the almost psychotic ravings of her prisoner, Akemi huffed and had one of her tails cleanly pierced through Kokebile's lower abdomen. Viciously yanking the tail out, Akemi flicked it to clear it of the fallen's blood. As a testament to his own countless centuries of experience, Kokebile only grunted at being impaled. Even still, the same grin stood on his face, mocking Akemi. Akemi was not one who liked to be mocked. You have 2 options available to you, you sad excuse for an angel. You tell me what I want to know or th will become very acquainted with one of my tails. Either way doesn't matter to me. If you don't talk, I'm sure that we can get that stupid devil buddy of yours too. Kokebile's grin only grew larger as he inched his face closer to Akemi, despite the fact that he had just moved in close enough for one of her tails to cut into the side of his neck. Do you know why so many of his angels fell? The sin most angels gave into was one of the 7. Some gave into pride, others, wrath, and even more sloth. Myself, Azazel, and hundreds of other angels, we fell because we gave into lust. Kokebile punctuated his declaration by attempting to kiss Akemi. Akemi's reflexes were honed from centuries of life and fighting her brother and sisters, as well as having spent decades living with shinobi, so she was more than prepared for the unexpected advance. All Kokebile got for his efforts was the horrendous pain of having his black feathered wings ripped from his body in a shower of blood and feathers. You stupid fucking bitch, all fucking key, was as far as Kokebile got before Akemi wrapped one of her tails around his throat and allowed her other tails to let go of his limbs, leaving the fallen angel to be suspended in the air by his neck alone. Panic set in as Kokebile realized that without his wings he would not be able to keep himself afloat, and so he began to claw at the furry appendage that restricted his intake of oxygen. He even began to summon dozens upon dozens of large light spears, either using them to attempt to stab into Akemi's tail or trying to distract her long enough to buy his freedom. Both failed. Any light spears aimed at her were blocked by one of her freed tails, and the tail constricting Kokebile's airway was reinforced with enough chakra to make it as hard as diamonds. Akemi watched all of this with a sneer of utter hatred and disgust. Filthy males. You think yourself worthy of kissing me? The strongest of the biju? The only person worthy of touching me in such a manner is a man better than you and stronger than you can ever hope to be. As she was prepared to verbally rip Kokebile to shreds and watch as the light slowly left his eyes, she felt an immense burst of power suddenly explode from the area she knew Naruto had been fighting the female devil. While it was nothing that her and Naruto had anything to be worried about, it was enough to warrant a moment of shock and surprise. What was even more worrying was that Akemi could tell that this massive boost in power was not something the female devil had done herself. Akemo could sense that the power boost was only thanks to an outside source that was now taking over the host's own power. With narrowed eyes, Akemi brought the still struggling Kokage close to her face and in voice dripping in anger asked, "How did she get that strong all of a sudden?" Kokage only grinned and lifted a hand to point behind Akemi. Turning, Akemi was only just barely able to raise one of her tails and catch the speeding form of Naruto before he could smash into a nearby pile of rubble. Akemi was a little surprised when she had to actually use some of her energy to raise a shield in front of her to block off the massive blast of devil magic. Using her other available 7 tails, she was able to stab them into the ground and form a wall which she had to reinforce with a chunk of chakra lest the attack tear through her barrier. When the attack finally let up, Akemi was quickly forced to weave out of the way of a punch aimed straight for her. Too late, she realized that the attack was only a distraction meant to allow the female devil to free Kokage from his furry prison. Cursing, she leapt a few feet back where she was accompanied by a panting Naruto. "Are you really having trouble with such a weak woman, Naruto-kun?" Naruto only childishly stuck his tongue out. "Unlike you, Akemi-chan, I want to keep them alive to be interrogated." "Yes, well, I think that may no longer be an option," Akemi said with a slight sneer as she witnessed Kokage ingest the same substance Naruto had seen Kateria had to gain her newfound power boost. Following was a similar explosion of power as Kokage's form was covered in the slithering things that covered Kateria's body in a similar fashion. Any wounds the two had sustained had been instantly healed and Kokage's wings had grown back, though they looked far more deadly and malicious than his original pairs had. The dark beauty his old wings had possessed replaced by a cold, almost metallic-looking feel. "About damn time you freed me, you stupid devil," Kokage sneered towards his savior. Kateria only crossed her arms under her massive bust and haughtily spoke, "If it wasn't for me you'd be dead already, so please shut your filthy mouth." Looking at the two, Naruto only sighed, "Yeah, I guess you're right, Akemi-chan. Guess we better get serious now, huh?" Akemi only grinned before she walked behind Naruto, draped her arms around his neck from behind, placed her head on his left shoulder, pressed her assets into his back, and huskily whispered into his ear, "I do enjoy seeing you when you get serious, Naruto-kun." Naruto nervously chuckled as he felt both Akemi's hot breath wash across his ear and neck and her breasts push against his back, but retained enough composure to summon 9 glowing chakra chains that looked to be dancing about in tandem with Akemi's own 9 tails. Following that, Naruto called upon his own unique chakra cloak that glowed a shade of midnight blue, a stark contrast to Akemi's blood-red cloak. With the cloak came some unique features none had seen before. His beautiful blues gained an almost ethereal glow to them that would have given him an angelic look if not for the pupils becoming slits that mirrored Akemi's. Whisker marks that had faded when he had freed Akemi appeared and darkened, adding to the beastly look. That was not the only noticeable difference though. With the two as physically close together as they were, some expected to see their two vastly different cloaks fight each other for dominance, but instead they saw that they mingled and mixed just like their owners, creating a beautiful shade of purple befitting those of royalty or high birth. The picture the two painted together as they stood there, bathed in the flames of blue, red, and purple while their extra appendages danced and coiled around them protectively, was one of power and intimacy, an image that would have made many quake as the combined power of the Kyuubi no Kitsune interlaced itself with the power of the Nidaime Rikudo Sennin. Across the battlefield, eyes turned to stare in wonder at the view before them. The view of the two strongest beings from the elemental nations so easily meshing together, blending their two chakras together so seamlessly that one would be hard-pressed to tell if the two had ceased to be two unique individuals and had instead become one being who had ascended to a level of power only seen amongst the ranks of the gods themselves. Instead of being frightened by the blatant display of power and teamwork, Kateria and Kokage only grinned cockily, thinking that their recent boost in power would allow them to easily defeat the two before them. Kateria was the first to react and unleashed a massive wave of devil magic that blazed with the intensity of the power that had been put into it. Naruto quickly extended his chains out and formed a wall of metal born of his unique chakra that stood strong and easily weathered the wave of devil magic, not once faltering or even cracking. As Naruto raised the protective wall, Kokage took his chance and summoned a veritable wall of light spears, each well over 10 feet long and thicker than 2 feet, and sent them hurtling towards the pair at astounding speeds. Neither Naruto or Akemi so much as blinked as Akemi's tails became a blur as they easily either caught or deflected the spears, allowing none to even come anywhere near the pair. "Let's show them why we are not to be trifled with, Naruto-kun," Akemi said with a grin of superiority stretching across her face. Neither moved from Thoth. Akemi's tails gathered together and formed into the shape of a cone, the points all meeting in one space. At the point where the tails joined to form the tip of the cone, a small ball of flames that glowed an almost clear blue color sprang to life. That soon changed, however, as the small flame that was only the size of a baseball began to grow in both size and intensity, the flames madly dancing around in what looked to be barely contained glee. Soon, however, the once blue ball transformed from the calm shade of blue into an intense inferno of white-hot flames that superheated the air around it to the point where waves of heat began to pulse outwards, visibly distorting the oxygen around it. Naruto grinned. "Oi Searsex, Michael, Azazel, you guys should probably reinforce that barrier of yours." Not waiting to see exactly why the sage would need the already impenetrable barriers to be reinforced even more, they only followed his advice, pouring even more energy into each of their respective sides, enough so that the barrier actually became visible. Soon their questions were answered as 9 of Naruto's chakra chains gathered around the massive ball of flames and began to form a dome of visible wind that screeched a high-pitched noise that was familiar to those that had seen him perform the Rasen Shuriken. Exerting even more pressure, Naruto managed to compress the ball of flames with his shield of wind, forcing the once massive flames back into the size of baseball. However, where once the flames had danced with glee, there was no such flicker, leaving only a glowing ball of compressed heat. Many people back in the elemental nations had come to fear and respect this technique, which was the trademark of the Biju and those jinchuriki who managed to gain their tenants' respect. This was the attack that Minato Namikaze had based his Rasengan off of. This was the feared Bijudama, tailed beast ball. However, this was the unique variant that Naruto and Akemi had created that possessed enough raw power to tear its way through anything and incinerate anything in its path, leaving not even ashes left. This was Bijudama, Rasen Shuriken, both Kateria and Kokabeel, who had been frozen in fear at the amount of gravitational force the two attacks, now one, were creating, could only watch in abhorrent terror as the massive construct of flame and wind headed their way, gouging a trench in both the ground and air that dared to stand in the way of the attack. Pure primal fear screamed at them from deep within the recesses of their minds for them to move, to run as far away from not only the attack but from the two monsters who had dared birth such a monstrosity and unleash it upon the world. That same fear, compounded with the near-crushing force of gravity that accompanied the attack, were what kept them from listening to the screams of their preservational instincts. Tethered to the spot they stood in, they could only watch as the fallen angel and devil gazed at the approaching form of their death-given corporeal form. Mere feet away from the attack striking them, distance in which they could damn near feel their blood boil from the intensity of the heat of the attack, a blur of white flashed in front of them, standing in between them and their death. Divide. 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 Divide, 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 divide. The once imposing attack was reduced from the glory of its former power into an attack that even some lesser beings could defend against, which is exactly what Valley Lucifer did, backhanding the attack and sending it careening into the barrier that surrounded the school, where it merely fizzled out of existence. Despite pulling off the rather impressive feat of defeating one of possibly the strongest attacks in the world, Valley did not look proud. Instead, the pristine white armor that made up the infamous juggernaut drive of his sacred gear, Divine Dividing, was heavily burned, in some places looking like it had been melted by the attack, while still yet more sections looked to have been torn to shreds by the vicious cutting power of wind, revealing that the winds had cut deep enough to cut inches into Valley's exposed white skin. Without the helmet to cover the Hakuryuku's visage, it was clear for all to see that absorbing that much power in such a short amount of time had left him weak and exhausted. "Well, that's an annoying ability," Akemi spoke, looking none too pleased by her and Naruto's joint attack being defeated. "I call hacks. Friggin' villains get all the cool powers, I swear. I mean, first Sasuke and his stupid Sharingan, then Pain and the Rinnegan, and of course Tobi and his annoying Kamui. Now this," Naruto childishly pouted. Akemi lightly laughed and snuggled her head into the crook of Naruto's neck. "Naru-kun, to be fair, you can heal from almost anything, you're biologically immortal, a perfect sage, and have enough chakra to compete with even me. That's not to much your skills with fuinjutsu, swordsmanship, and the fact that most of your jutsu can devastate even large armies." Naruto only laughed as he rubbed the back of his head. "Guess you're right about that." Turning an annoyed glare at the still panting Valley, he continued, "Still not cool though. I mean, sure, we underpowered it by a lot, but for him to just pop up and destroy it like that, it's like some Deus Ex Machina crap." Eyes shot open wide and jaws dropped as Naruto causally said that the attack they had unleashed was actually underpowered. Valley only spat out a glob of blood before he grabbed both Kateria and Kokabeel, threw the still catatonic devil and fallen over his shoulders as a portal seemingly ripped itself through thin air. From the portal emerged a teen with shaggy black hair dressed in the uniform that looked like it belonged to some private school or other. Taking stock of the situation, he merely turned interested eyes upon the deeply wounded Valley and his two passengers. Raising an eyebrow, he gestured for Valley to make his way through the portal. Interesting. It would seem that you have failed. An unexpected turn of events." Valley only spat in return. "Whatever, we were caught off guard by those two," the Lucifer descendant said in gesture to Naruto and Akemi. "Another Kyuubi? Interesting, I had thought that Kuno and Yasaka were the only two, though it seems this one is stronger than Yasaka." "Yeah, well, apparently our intel was wrong," Valley angrily retorted. The two soon walked through the portal, it closing behind them with neither Naruto or Akemi making any move to follow. They were soon joined by Rias and her peerage, the faction leaders, and Sona and her peerage. Issei seemed to be the only one who had sustained any real damage, which came as no surprise as he had been facing off against Valley, who was leaps and bounds ahead of him. Asia was helping out any who had been injured by using her twilight healing, meaning that none had really been hurt by the surprise attack and that all that had happened was the school being reduced to rubble, which could easily be fixed. Naruto and Akemi had long since recalled their cloaks, though Akemi was all too happy to remain in her current position, her tails softly waving in the breeze. Rias stepped forward, an annoyed glare directed at Akemi. Why didn't you stop them? Wouldn't it have saved us more trouble in the long run? Naruto was suddenly serious, eyes narrowed and thought. Normally yes, however we needed them as sort of messengers. They had to rely on not only whatever the hell Office gave to them to even have any hope of living, not to mention they still lost and would have died if not for Valley jumping at the last minute. Rias only raised a delicate eyebrow. Searsek stepped forward and spoke up. What Naruto means is that with them escaping to report to whoever their boss is, they will spread the message that they are severely outgunned. Neither myself or any of the others had to even step in to stop them in their tracks, which will spread fear amongst their numbers. Naruto nodded, and that fear will at least for the time being, which will give us time to prepare for whenever they decide to strike. Both Issei and Kiba cried tears of depression when they realized what that meant for them. Naruto laughed and patted the two on the back. Ah, don't be like that, guys. This just means that we have more to train you too. Rias shook her head in both humor at her training nut of a fiancé as well as pity at what he would do to her peerage members. Ufufufu, why Uzumaki-kun, I never thought I would see this side of you. Akeno laughed, openly leering at Naruto now. Naruto only turned and smiled at the Miko-dressed devil. I have no idea what you mean, Akeno-chan. Everyone present could only laugh while Kiba and Issei hugged and shared in their tears of sadness. The end.